Welcome to a special year-end edition of the France 24 debate. I'm François Picard. What to say when a youth movement turns 50? During the coming year, if you follow things French, you will be seeing, hearing, and reading a lot about the golden anniversary of May 68. That's when a small student protest in favor of co-ed dormitories would snowball into a general strike that would shut down the country. Similar mass movements erupting elsewhere in Europe and around the globe. It was not about the Prague Spring uprising against the Soviets at the time, not the Vietnam War, not civil rights. In this country, there was a lot of leftist rhetoric, plenty of blowback against a decade of conservative rule under General de Gaulle. But the protests only became about class struggle per se when the movement spread beyond students to trade unions. Rather, if still today those 6 weeks are still firmly ingrained in this nation's psyche, it's because May 68 signaled the coming of age of the baby boomer generation. Those who grew up after the Second World War wanted to live by different rules. Demographers might argue it was the moment the me generation took power, and some even say they have yet to concede it. Is that true? What's the meaning of May 68? Joining us as a 27-year-old photojournalist, Bruno Barbet was there. He covered May 68 for the great Magnum Photo Agency. Thanks for being with us.
Good morning.
Good evening.
Oh, good evening.
Whatever, good day. We're going to be asking Bruno if he has compromising pictures of France's former Environment Minister, Brice Lalonde, today Special Advisor to the UN on Sustainable Development, but who in May 1968 was president of the Sorbonne University branch of the big UNEF left-wing student union. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for inviting me.
All right. Anne-Louise Milne lectures at the University of London Institute in Paris, the author of May 68, Rethinking France's Last Revolution. Thanks for joining us.
Hi.
Now, don't count on François Picard to get teary-eyed during the show. The intellectual historian who teaches at Paris's Nanterre University is the author of How the World Swung to the Right, and in French of, I guess I translate it as counter-narrative of May, what the embalmers and gravediggers of 68 don't tell their successors. Is that roughly?
Perfect translation.
Oh, well, thank you. Thanks for being with us, by the way. The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate, a show, by the way, you can podcast on iTunes. There were no iTunes in May of 1968. At the time, there was a tight leash on state broadcast media. And that's why if we could call up one of perhaps Bruno Barbet's photos, we could say that they really are iconic. This one is one for the ages. Bruno, tell us about this picture.
Yes. This is Boulevard Saint-Germain. It was taken at the beginning of May 68, as far as I could remember, probably the 3rd of May. And there was, not so far from La Sorbonne, there was a big riot on the Boulevard Saint-Germain, you know, in Paris, is where the students near at the corner of Boulevard Saint-Michel. So we are right in the middle of Quartier Latin.
Right in the middle of the Latin Quarter. At the time, the snowballing of all this catches France off guard. There had been a famous editorial a month earlier in the newspaper Le Monde saying France is bored. What were your thoughts when you were shooting this?
Well, you know, the strange thing is that in 68, I mean, France was one of, there was no, as far as I remember, unemployment. There was no people jobless. Things were doing very well. And it's only after 73, the oil crisis in 73. So one wonder why there was such uprisal. I guess, indeed, there was a desire to change the society, to have more freedom, also to escape the civilization of consumption, and also there was
consumer society.
Yeah, and also there was, of course, not only riots in Paris. There was riot in London. There was in Italy, all around in Japan, and also against Vietnam War. Well, Vietnam War was also one of the big catalysateur. I don't know.
Catalysts.
Yeah.
Vietnam for the movement around the globe. But I want to ask about here in France. Brice Lalonde, simple question: why'd you go on strike?
In '68, you
yes.
mean? Well, it was not a strike actually. we were cross in the university because the baby boomers, as you said, the university was not at all ready for that. It was so crowded, and we had the impression the teachers were looking down on us. All these guys.
Yeah, the professors were called mandarins, right?
Yes, mandarins. So this would, we felt scorned a bit, and we wanted. There was every day there was a new reform de l'université. So the new minister of education wanted to reform the university, and in the end, even some people who had succeeded in the examination, they had to we passed them, and they were getting mad at that. And there was some insatisfaction in France because there had been some rioting also in some cities, for instance, in Caen and places like that. And we were very internationalist. We felt very close to the Mexican, Mexican students were just shot down in the stadium. We had the Berkeley free speech movement. You had something in Berlin. We were telephoning every day to Berlin. What's happening? Rudi Dutschke and all these guys. So we felt very internationalist in a country which was very national. Nothing,
people in the position of power were nationalists, and you felt internationalist.
Exactly.
Look at the picture here by Bruno Barbet.
Very nice picture.
And near the Place de la Bastille during those demonstrations. What were you thinking when all this was going on? Do you remember what you thought?
Well, I was a bit overwhelmed, I must say. But you must also know that in the student organizations movement, the spirit of the days of revolution in Paris, it was lively, and lots of people felt we need now to go and wake up or to have the support of the workers. So the link between the students and the workers was one of the mottos of 68.
But it wasn't at the beginning.
No, it was not at the beginning, but it started.
Anna-Louise Milne, do any of your students, do any of your fellow professors, do they know what May 68 is?
Yeah, sure. I think everybody knows what May 68 is. I think
everybody?
Unquestionably. A lot of people. I think a lot of the rhetoric that still hangs around, even some of the street art that we see, is still, very much rooted in that moment of kind of protest, of uprising. No, I think May 68 still marks the world we live in, and that it's a familiar, at least iconic image for students even today. Yeah, even for my students, the British students.
And when you think back to that watershed moment now, the takeaway. What is it?
The takeaway is unpredictability. I think, you've used the term snowballing. Brissalon just used the notion of it being lively. I think one of the things when you look at those events is how quickly things moved and they moved into unpredictable spaces, and people moved into spaces they'd never been in before, and there was kind of connections made that hadn't ever been made. But I think as well, the other thing, listening to you, is you cite the article, France was bored. I personally would say that where the academic study of 1968 is at the moment is to say we need to put this in a much longer trajectory and not imagine that it kind of suddenly erupted, there was a spark and then wildfire. No, this is something that needs to be understood in the long trajectory of decolonization in particular. And, and 10 years ago, in the 40th anniversary of 68, one of the terms that was around was to talk about the years of 68 and to kind of anchor it in a history that goes from 1962 to 1972, 73.
Yeah, the post-colonial mentality. When you think back, François Picard, and you teach at the university where actually it all started, not in May, in fact, but in March.
Yes. Yes, it started in March. It wouldn't start in March of 2018, I'm afraid, but it did start back then there. I would just add one thing, which is that things were not doing so well for everybody back then. For students and people of the gentry, indeed, situation was okay. I mean, now we tend to judge a country by its unemployment rate, which I don't think is the only criterion. But by that criterion, yes, indeed, it was okay. But if you were a factory worker, if you were from the former colonies who had just decolonized, if you were a migrant, if you were a woman, if you were a gay person, I don't think things were doing so well in France in 1968, which is also the reason why it went viral. Because I suppose just...
But is it also rising expectations? Bruno Barbet was mentioning how in 68 the unemployment rate is low. You've come out of the post-war years. The country's doing better and better, and that's when people want the freedoms and the that Brice Lalonde was describing a short while ago, rising aspirations.
We should never separate, I think, cultural or social freedoms, such as sexual liberation, listening to rock and roll and all these things, and the political dimension of May 68. After May 68, we have separated these two. We tend to say that today there was a cultural victory of May 68, and I would say a political failure, because obviously communism or leftism did not take power. Indeed, back then, it was all one thing. You would go down in the street and you would protest and you would want the world to change.
But they weren't talking about the Prague Spring, which was going on at the same time. The brave people of then Czechoslovakia rebelling against the Soviet domination.
They were in tune and in touch with lots of movements, similar movements around the world, from Latin America to Japan to the rest of Europe, and indeed to those fighting the Soviet, form of communism.
Bruno Barbet, what strikes us when we were looking at some of your photos was that some of the students, they're not hippies. Some of them are wearing neckties.
Exactly, they were very with a nice tie.
Because in mass media we tend to depict 68. Yeah, we can see this picture. Well, you can't see it there because it's closely cropped. But you see there they were well dressed with jackets. These aren't hippies.
Correct. Yes, that's something which, when you look the photograph 50 years later, how formal were some students. But I would like just to come back to what François says. I mean, what for me was fascinating, what May 68 was fascinating, is the dialogue suddenly between, and at the end of May 68, the fact that le comportement, the behavior of the patron and the workers, they start to have a better understanding and communication, which was not the case.
Before it was what? There's the boss?
And it was very conservative. I guess compare even to countries like Germany at that time, where the union were strong. And that's, I think, one of the interesting points of May 68.
To make things informal, yeah.
To make things more open in terms of dialogue.
Indeed, management, the economy used some of the lessons of May 68 to change the type of relations you have within a corporation. But that's, I would say, a detour. That's using it for another purpose. Back then, informality was partying in the street, was sexual liberation, was a global movement of emancipation. It was not for, a more informal atmosphere within an office.
Brice Lalonde, there's rising aspirations for a lot of the students. We see the well-dressed ones in that picture. Life is better than that of their parents, but at the same time, you still have in the late 60s an acute housing crisis. I've read that a student who had the key to a chambre de bonne, a studio, was a god in a way, because then he could have a tryst with a girl. There was nowhere to be if you wanted to be alone with a girl at that time. Or the boy.
I don't remember that, but okay. But I think what my friend from London said is true. I mean, I was very proud to be a student and to be in UNEF. It was the only trade union. It was not left or right. It was the only one. And in 1962, it's the students who started demonstrating to be a force in France to stop the war in Algeria, la paix en Algérie. And for me, it was very important. I was getting young. I mean, I was getting old at that time, and so that's my first relation to politics was to stop the war in Algeria and to join the students who succeeded in doing that as the first movement. And what we wanted to do in May 68, we wanted to be useful. We wanted to be useful. We wanted to change the world, yes. And now about the failure. What was in May 68, you had the Gaullists and the Communists. These were the two dominant parties. And they agreed. They had this sort of an agreement between them on nothing more important than the nation, nothing more important than go work and shut up, very hierarchical society. And what happened after is that 2 years or 3 years after, boom, the whole thing broke. You had the socialists who got more important than the communists, and you had Giscard d'Estaing as a sort of a new liberal, conservative liberal who won over the Gaullists. And that changed the whole pattern, because these guys were more European, they were more for decentralization, they were more for consumerism, and the women's lib movement started in May 68. So it was, I think, highly successful in changing the French society.
Highly successful in changing the French society. Did it change as well, France is still, in a way, what you describe the Gaullist and the communists as conservative, the two of them.
Sure.
France still has a touch of that conservatism today.
Well, much less, you can say, much less, because look, we've got a new president. He's very European, and you know, of course, we still have a president,
right?
And he's a bit like a king. That's for sure.
Yeah, and Louise Mill, will there be commemorations of the student protests in London come next May?
Well, what I can say is there's certainly a lot of interest in what happened in May 68. I mean, I think everybody's looking to see what sort of possible re-emergence of that type of politicization of students and how that kind of, how a student-driven protest might connect with other forms of protest and unrest in society. So I think certainly, I mean, I know there's a lot of preparations around amongst colleagues to run different sorts of conferences and things like that. Whether it'll tip over into the sorts of mainstream public movement and awareness remains to be seen. Equally, I'd say in France, it remains to be seen whether or not this is now essentially the preserve of historians, or whether May 68 remains a reference point for some of the, I think, very real sense of unrest, of dissatisfaction, of really full-blown alienation that there is amongst the student population today in France as well. The young people, I mean, I don't think we should restrict
We'll talk about that in part two. Just a quick question before we go to the break to Bruno Barbet. Just to remind viewers, on May 30th of 1968, there was the sort of the backlash of the right, this giant demonstration in Paris. There were snap elections that followed, and it was a landslide for the conservatives. That's also part of the story.
Well, at the beginning of May, you're right, there was the biggest demonstration ended in Rue Gay-Lussac. And I remember going there early morning, you know, it was still dark. And I had the feeling to be in the street of Beirut during the Civil War. There was hundreds of cars burned and turned all around that street. But it's only at the end of May that there was a big demonstration, I think it was the 23rd of May, where indeed, but François can explain more about how important it was. It's the workers and the students together.
So the workers and the students on the one side, the conservative backlash on the other.
The Communist Party.
What May 68 means, we're going to talk about it when we come back. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate.
People and Profit, presented by Stephen Carroll.
Business news is not about numbers, nor percentages and statistics. Business news is about people and how we live our lives. People and Profit goes beyond numbers to analyse how the global flow of money and profits shape our world. Intelligent and accessible, the show cuts across business, economics and politics.
People and Profit, on France 24 and France24.com.
Welcome back to the France 24 newsroom. I'm Rochelle Harrison-Pless with the headlines this hour. Evacuations are underway for dozens of Syrian civilians in need of urgent medical aid, a lifeline for 29 critically ill patients who are being taken from the besieged suburb of eastern Ghouta to hospitals in Damascus. It's part of a deal between rebels and the Syrian regime. It's the latest twist in a case that sent shockwaves through Argentina. A federal judge rules that prosecutor Alberto Nisman was murdered and did not commit suicide. His death in 2015 came just days after he accused the country's then president, Cristina Fernández de Kirchner, of covering up Iran's alleged role in a 1994 deadly bombing in Buenos Aires. 2017 was Mexico's deadliest year in 2 decades. The country's homicide rate skyrocketing, with 23,101 murders taking place between January and November 2017. The record-breaking number deals a blow to the Mexican leader who promised to get gang violence under control before next year's presidential election. And France's unemployment rate has slumped to its lowest level in 3 years. The number fell by 0.8% in November to 3,450,000 job seekers. President Emmanuel Macron has promised to tackle unemployment and has now come under fire over his controversial policies for those on the dole, with plans for a welfare crackdown. You're up to date here on France 24. Lots more news coming up, but first it's back to the debate with François Picard.
Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's a special year-end edition of the France 24 debate, and we're coming up to the 50th anniversary of the big student protests that hit France, Europe, and the world, here known as Mai 68, May 68. Bruno Barbet, Magnum photographer, covered the events for that prestigious photo agency. Also with us, Brice Lalonde, at the time, the president for the Sorbonne branch of the UNEF student union. He's gone on to become environment minister, UN special advisor on the sustainable development. With us as well, François Picard, who is an intellectual historian, teaches at Nanterre University, the author in French of How the World Swung to the Right and Counter-Narrative of May, What the Embalmers and Grave Diggers of 68 Don't Tell Their Successors. And from London, Anna-Louise Milne, who lectures at the University of London, and the author of May 68, Rethinking France's Last Revolution. To understand May 68, take a look at the writing on the wall. One of the signature traits of that movement are all the slogans that were graffitied onto walls at the time. Those slogans, like this one, professors, you're old, urbanism, cleanness, sexuality. Choose plutôt la vie. I guess that's kind of choose life. Not really, because that has then the connotation that we're talking about the abortion movement.
With the pro-life
it's got nothing to do with the pro-life movement. A lot of it is, and then here's this one against the media at the time. The police speaks to you every night at 8 p.m. Let me, François Picard, let me ask you about that one. The police speaks to you every night at 8 p.m.
Well, yeah, that's the TV news, and back then it was state-owned televisions. It was de Gaulle speaking to the world, or to France at least, and that's actually what lots of baby boomers or leaders of the 68 movement made of May 68 after May 68, which is a media revolution. Lots of them became, heads of big media groups or advertising agencies and said, okay, well, if May 68 did not bring to power, equality and justice, at least it, changed the landscape of media and means of expression. So, and with television and newspapers of the old world, and welcome to a new spirit, which will give birth to media as we know them today. I'm not sure freedom of speech, has really great results at this level. I mean, seeing the way May 68 is commemorated by the media. I don't think it's going to start again tomorrow morning.
You don't think there's going to be a big commemoration, or it's going to be sort of misconstrued?
Well, it's museified, it's congealed, and I think the main lesson of May 68, and that's what our British historian just said, is the unpredictability of it. So you can commemorate it until the end of time. It still might start again tomorrow morning without any of us, being able to predict it, and it will take another form. The only thing that won't change is the fact that very different people will be involved, exactly like May 68 sort of broke the left in pieces because it was about feminism, gay rights, factory workers, immigration, the Vietnam War, such different issues that were all suddenly converged into one major unrest.
Brice Lalonde, is there one of those slogans that stands out in your mind, and what can we learn from that graffiti on the wall that we saw?
Well, it was actually a freedom of speech. People wanted to speak. For instance, it was very impressive in La Sorbonne when it was occupied. So many people came to speak. to speak to each other, to speak, like if the lid was suddenly broken and people suddenly were so happy to speak.
So
that was fantastic.
Remind us then, the Sorbonne is occupied by the students.
By the students, and it was not easy to keep clean and everything, I remember, and to get enough food and, every night to clean. And so many people of Paris, all the people, and from everywhere came, and, it was becoming a sort of a touristic
and at one point, there's a famous moment when Jean-Paul Sartre, the great French intellectual, goes in, and he's old and he has trouble seeing, and somebody puts a big sign in front of him saying, "Sartre, be brief when you speak." So in other words, they didn't care anymore about Sartre.
Aragon,
the poet.
Yes, the poet. But now to tell you, after May 68 and after the backlash, the lid came back. And for me, my personal remembrance is that the spirit of May 68 stayed with Charlie Hebdo, Harakiri and Charlie Hebdo. And each week we had this moment of joy, having this not unrespectful newspaper making fun of everything, but starting also to introduce some ecology and things like that. And that's why, for me, one of the end of May 68 was the killing of all these people by the Islamist radicals.
When you see Bruno Barbet, 2011, the Arab Spring, there's this... we didn't know where it came from. It suddenly did. People talked about a leaderless revolution at the time. And then, of course, it ended in heartbreak for most countries that experienced the Arab Spring. Did you get a sense of that back then? That also that there's this great moment of elation, and then afterwards, poof, there's a reaction.
Well, that's another question. I mean, what happened in Libya, in Tunisia, in Egypt, the Arab Spring, and then at the end, people say, well, if you are very pragmatic, say maybe it was better to keep Gaddafi or even Saddam Hussein. After all, I mean, it's another story. But to come back,
but there are a lot of people who never got over May 68.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. But to come back to May 68, I would say there was a lot of poetry also, with the slogans. One of the slogans was, it's hard for me to translate in English, but it's "Sous les pavés, la plage."
Under the cobblestones, you'll find the beach.
So
the idea that...
Can you understand that? Strangely enough, I was 2 years ago in Hong Kong for the Umbrella Revolution, and I took a picture of a young couple sleeping in the highway in front of the High Commissioner, the big Hotel de Ville. And there was a poster, "Sous les pavés, la plage." So we are in China, and this slogan is still used. That's very strange.
Anna-Louise Milne, we were talking earlier, we heard François Cusset mention how those that took part in the movement in 68, we heard Brice Lalonde say that that's where he got his political schooling, if you will. That baby boomer generation, which by force of numbers, still a lot of people, they're reaching retirement age or have already reached it. Are they still in a certain way in power?
Well, I mean, I think that, evidently there are some people who are deeply associated with May 68 who remain significant public intellectuals, figures whose names are brought out, cited in the context, for example, of Macron's election. People who are interested in which 68ers had signed up and at what stage they'd signed up to the Macron movement. In that sense, it remains a kind of, let's say, a point of reference for contemporary mainstream politics. I'm not sure that they're the most significant forces for change in society at this point in time, though. As François Cusset is saying, if there are forces, if there's any kind of, a transformational force at work in society, it's almost certainly happening in spaces that we're not really watching that closely, and certainly probably not watching through the lens of May 68.
So wait, we have two competing narratives here, François Cusset. We have the blowback against the colonialism, against the parents' generation, which occupied Algeria, for instance, and for the case of France, this sort of thing, the post-colonial generation that's internationalist, that looks beyond France's borders. And then there's the me generation. Well, it's our turn to be the ones who are who have power. And some might argue they've kept that power.
No, what's amazing is the collective narcissism of the May 68 or the baby boomers generation. They're the first generation who actually managed to, put in place such changes, such global changes. And it's true that they have retained power all the way until today. They're also the ones who have made somehow subversion marketable. They have sold it. They have invented the media of the late 20th century. The only thing I would say is that very often, some of them, not all of them, but some of them have taught the following lesson to the younger generation, which is it's no longer worth rebelling, taking the street, or trying to overthrow power in place. It doesn't really work. What's more important is to change, behaviors, the media, to be sexy and subversive. This lesson is wrong, because for the younger generation of today, for people who are 20-year-old today, whether they are in North Africa, South America, or center of Europe and the US. It's why and how they can protest today, which is the real question. And sometimes the baby boomers generation tends to ask for an end to this tradition of protest. They have become reactionary for some of them, yes.
Brice Lalonde, in this country, we now have a 39-year-old president. In the United States, the last presidential election was between two people who were approaching 70 years of age.
I would like to say
who were baby boomers.
One thing which is very important in May 68, people didn't kill each other. No shooting, no killing, no pacific. It's very important. But that means on both sides there was some moderation, and people were very careful not to go too far and not to have irreversible things. Okay, so perhaps it goes to your point.
Well, it's a bit of a miracle no one was killed. Listening to what Bruno Barbet said earlier.
One other thing which is very important, if we're talking about Mr. Macron now today, is that Mr. Macron, he wants to do something for the planet, okay? And he showed that in last December by organizing his summit, by saying we make the planet great again, which is a funny slogan. That comes from May 68. That comes from May 68. To create a movement, how do you create a movement? How do you organize? How do you mobilize? And how do you try to go further than the nation to try to help humanity?
But it can't be top-down. You agree with that?
It can.
It cannot be top-down.
Indeed, it can.
It has to be everywhere, but somebody has to take the lead. You need to have a Nelson Mandela of the climate. You need to do something like that. You need to speak. And you need to have the idea that ruling a country is not only serving your own interests, but also trying to serve humanity's interests. That comes from May 68.
And to the charge that your generation has clung to power, how do you plead, sir?
Well, I would love to be in power.
You don't think it's the case?
No, I don't think. I think it's exaggeration. I mean, May 68 was done by unknown people, most of it unknown people, rank and file students and things like that. And of course, all the little parties pretended they were putting all the writing in front of the demonstrations, but no, they did not handle anything. It's all rank and file people. And after, of course, you have people in the media, you have some newspapers which were created, you have Actuel, things like that. But no, May 68 was something anonymous.
Bruno Barbet, you travel all around the world for assignments. You go to places where the population is very young. Here in France and in neighboring Germany, we have an aging population, well, throughout Western Europe. What do you think about, has the me generation handed over power yet to the younger generations?
Well, it's hard to. You mean what
is that May 68 generation still in power?
Why do you say me generation?
Well, that was the expression used in the United States for those of that era.
No, I think there is still a spirit, which comes from May 68. Still something remained. That's why, indeed, the fact that what surprised me in May 68, at the beginning of May 68, is to see suddenly everybody speak to one and to another,
Yeah.
The workers, the patron, le concierge. There was an incredible dialogue between the different society, level of society. That's
there's one thing I think is very important. It's knowledge, science, knowledge, university, which is so important. And look what today we can see the religions coming back, people who don't believe in science anymore.
But Bruno,
the dimension of science, university, is also May 68. It's the students who did that.
Bruno Barbet talks, one of the slogans of May 68 was speak to your neighbors.
Yes, true.
Is there enough of that being done today?
Not enough, never enough.
Well, the thing is, it can only happen, speaking to your neighbors and to everyone, in fact, when the ordinary life is suspended by the course of events. For example, a general strike, so you can't go to work, you can't take public transportation, you cannot even go shopping. What do you do then? Well, that's when you start speaking to each other. And this has happened everywhere in the world
Facebook.
and many times since May 68. Let's not believe that it's the end of an era, because lots of people tend to praise and embalm May 68 as the end of a long historical sequence. All right, the revolution is over. Okay, now we'll try to make money and be happy. But no, it's not over, as you can see in the history between May 68 and now. Lots of things have happened.
Anna-Louise Milne, 50 years on, do citizens speak to their neighbors?
Yeah, well, I mean, I would tend to agree that it's a question of time. And one of the things that was really interesting when you look at all the testimonies for May 68, and I wasn't there, so my experience is always is that of trying to understand what happened through documents, through imagery as well, and through personal accounts. And one of the things that comes through really strongly is that people had time. And so it wasn't just about a kind of capturing of speech, as they say, of the prise de la parole, but also of that kind of capturing back of time, and particularly in the space of the factory, so that people gathered within factories, but they weren't there to work, they were there to exchange, to debate, to print posters, to imagine new ways of living. And I think that, so speak to your neighbours, yes, but quite simply speak and act, as opposed to being kind of like tied very often to the assembly line, to very, very demanding rhythms of work. The term that comes through again and again in the testimony is precisely that freeing up of time. And I think we make a lot of the iconography of May 68, we make a lot of the words and the slogans, as you've said, but actually one of the things that we need to look at today is precisely how people are taking back forms, or are trying in any case to take back control of their experience of time and of their experience of space. So the kind of Occupy movement that's occurred around the world, for me that is one interesting way of understanding what we might take today from May 68. And I just add, just simply, I mean, it's not entirely true to say that the movement was solely pacifist. I mean, there were deaths in May 68. We tend to undermine as well, or underplay, I think, the levels of violence and the levels of confrontation that there were. It was a period of quite extreme police violence, and that comes through indeed in the iconography, the hatred of the police, and that remains something which is certainly very relevant for politics today in France, and I think probably elsewhere in the world as well.
All right, let's try to make sense of how people have moved on in their political culture. Anne-Louise Milne there mentioning the need to sort of take a breather and slow down time to talk things over, talk things through. There's a question whether or not that's relevant today, whether it happens enough today. In the last presidential election in this country, Emmanuel Macron finished tops in the first round on 24%, ahead of the far right Marine Le Pen on 21%. What's interesting is that when pollsters broke down the vote by age category, it's Le Pen who wins the youth vote, 1/4 of the 18 to 34-year-olds, just ahead of the communist-backed Jean-Luc Mélenchon. As for baby boomers, if you look at this graph, the older they get, the more they seem to vote for the conservative candidate, François Fillon. Again, those were first-round votes. That's opinion polls that were taken after the election. What's your experience, François Cusset, you who teaches at Nanterre University, where it all started, your students, politically, how plugged in are they to these questions we're talking about? The political space, what kind of politics? Brice Lalonde's cause of trying to bring the world together on important issues like the environment.
Well, I think the violence we're talking about, whether it's the violence of the police or the violence of our lifestyles, trying to find a job, trying to survive in an office, or just, fighting the bad things of today, that violence, the younger generation is particularly aware of it because they live with it. And the difference with May 68 is probably the fact that now 90% of a generation goes to college, at least, starts a course of higher studies. And therefore, it's much more of a post-colonial landscape, you know, full of strange foreigners, descendants of immigrants, French of all social classes instead of just the gentry, as it was the case.
And do they talk politics?
They talk politics, but I don't think they focus on Franco-French politics precisely because they come from all over the world and from everywhere. So they are probably more sensitive to environmental issues, to the Arab Springs, to the link between religion and politics, which was not a big thing in May 68, right? So there is a different agenda, but what remains is how can we, as you know, the younger generation, be the agent of change? How can we change things?
Anna-Louise Milne, what's the conversation among your students?
Yeah, my students, well, one of the big conversations is obviously questions of things like student debt, you know, I mean, not an issue that's so prevalent in France because the educational structures work differently, but, you know, debt, student opportunities, job opportunities, mobility in the world. I mean, I was very interested when I was looking back through some of the May iconography of actually how kind of present reflections on that freedom of movement, crossing borders. Some of you may remember, I'm sure, that there was the whole issue of Danny Cohn-Bendit being extradited, returned to Germany, returning to France illegally, and crossing the border via Belgium as a kind of act of protest against his, you know, the fact that he had been banned from France. I think sort of, you know, for students today, and obviously I'm speaking from, you know, the land of Brexit, sadly, that question of mobility in the world remains really, is really right high on the agenda, I think, for us. And that was an issue in May. It's not one of the ones we tend to retain from the May history, but yeah, I think.
But when you see, Anna-Louise, when you see that 1/4, according to that survey, of 18 to 34-year-olds voted for Marine Le Pen in France, when you mentioned the Brexit vote, do you get the sense that, well, the younger generation is perhaps reactionary? More reactionary?
I think the younger generation is anxious, frightened, and some are taking, you know, recourse to very conservative solutions, nationalist solutions of, you know, but I think that equally, you know, certainly in the UK, as many are also looking to really reinforce the possibilities of transformation and movement in society and freedom of movement in all directions, not just the first world students' freedom of movement through things like Erasmus programs, but the possibility of living in a fully diverse, egalitarian society. I certainly hear plenty of that amongst my students, yeah.
In May 68, we were, of course, in our culture full of the Parisian revolutionary days of the 19th century and things like that, with the barricades and things like that. But we believed in an ideal. We believed in progress. We believed in tomorrow will be better than today. We believed in politics. We can do it. I mean, you know, you do it, you can campaign, you can build a collective force, and you do it. And now, of course, I think today the problem is there's no more utopia, or there's no more big vision, or there's no more big idea, which would probably, you know...
But you heard François Picard say his students do want to make the world a better place.
Good. And I would add that you don't need one utopia or one major grand narrative, right? What you need is specific causes, but radical ones, you know? And sex equality, the environment, a real social unrest so you change conditions of labor. These are specific issues that the younger generation believes in. But it's true, they no longer use the big words, you know, with capital letters of the communist utopia of yesterday. But they still, you know, they have a way of continuing it with more specific causes.
More pragmatic, perhaps?
Bruno Barbet, is one of the lessons of May 68? Well, I know it's a bit trite to say it. The world has gotten to be a smaller place.
Yeah, but in the meantime, I just share what you just said. I mean, today, the youth, maybe dépolitisation from the youth. But in the meantime...
turn off from politics.
Yeah, but still there is a big concern, for example, about environment issues, obviously. And that's one of the biggest issues we have. And I think young people from all political boards are concerned about these issues.
So we get back to the original question.
Yeah. Why
are the French in particular so obsessed with May 68?
Well, it's complicated. I guess there's the generation of Greece, for example. That generation is still there, the actor of May 68. So 50 years anniversaries, the last feu d'artifice. I mean,
the last hurrah, you say?
Yes, yes.
This will be the last hurrah in 2018?
I think there's still some debates right now. Huh? Yes, May 68 was a collective movement, which is important. And you don't have such movements every day. So that's for sure. But now there is some discussion about permissivity or Dr. Spock, I don't know. Your children must behave better and things like that. So there is this discussion of what are the bounds? Do you put any limits to freedom? What are they, etc., etc. This discussion, I mean, it will always go on. In May 68, we broke the lid, I would say. That was heavy on French society. And now, of course, we did not manage all what happened after, unpredictable. And there we are. And myself, I was on the environment because I suddenly thought that's the cause of the century. And others, something else, the women's lib, regional decentralization, lots of things like that. And it's true that today lots of young people go to try to help in a developing country for 1 year and things like that. So they're very concerned about, as I said, globalism, internationalism. I mean, that's one of the biggest legacy, I think, and one of the beautifulest legacy. Stay internationalist. And that is also aligned with the workers' utopia of before. We don't like nationalism. We don't like, we like to welcome people, and we like intellectual to think about the world, to say words about the world, and to build utopias. Come on, we like that also.
All right, the importance of building utopias. That will be the final word. Brice Lalonde, I want to thank you. I want to thank François Picard, Bruno Barbet, and Louise Milne for being with us from London. Thank you for joining us for this special edition of the France 24 debate.